Hello, good listeners. Welcome to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives with another story about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dyck. If you were born in the mid-20th century or earlier, chances are your schooling taught that newly arrived European settlers on the prairies saw barren land, mostly empty of people, except for some groups of nomadic indigenous hunters and gatherers and some fur traders. But that's only one side of a bigger story. Land in Manitoba that Mennonites settled became known as the East and West Reserves, more commonly known as the Steinbach and Winkler-Altona areas in today's terms. The land is part of Treaty 1 territory, a treaty that was negotiated between First Nations people and the Canadian government in 1871. But Indigenous people and government treaty negotiators had vastly different understandings of Treaty 1. One source to draw from is Rosemary Cousina, an editor with Archaeological Services of the Canada Park Service. She wrote in a 1990 edition of the Mennonite Historian that, quote, "The natives envisioned large areas of prairie where they could fish and hunt freely without the intrusion of settlers, and that the government's plan was to populate the region with European citizens, establishing farms and villages with small tracts of land set aside for the natives." Unquote. To sharpen her point, Cousina cites letters from the province's lieutenant governor to the Secretary of State for the provinces. Here's a quote. "They've been led to suppose that large tracts of land were to be set aside for them as hunting grounds, including timberlands. They wished to have about 2/3 of the province. We then told them it was of no use for them to entertain any such ideas. We told them whether they wished it or not, immigrants would come in and fill up the country." Did First Nations leaders fully comprehend the scale and impact the arriving settlers would have on them and their communities? Cousina's research doesn't clearly answer this question, but we do know that they had different expectations from the treaty agreement. Cousina writes, quote, "While the band thought the government would enforce the boundaries of these newly established reserves, it actually took the Indian Affairs Administration another 2 years to authorize any surveys to officially designate those parameters. Finally, in the fall of 1873, the surveys were done for all the Treaty No. 1 reserves except for the Roseau River Band. It was not until 1882, 11 years after the signing of the treaty, that the final adjustments were completed." Unquote. During the time it took to authorize and complete those surveys, Cousina notes that the Indigenous people were, quote, "forced to put up with a lot of related problems, mainly of settlers trespassing to cut timber and even occupying those areas which the band could not legally prove was theirs." Unquote. These kinds of historical references are one way Mennonites can learn about the land they call home today. But there are other ways, too. Jonathan Hildebrand is a Ph.D. student in history at the University of Manitoba and is originally from Altona, Manitoba. Previously, he worked for nearly a decade as an urban planner in the areas of land use, urban design, and Indigenous planning, before returning to school to learn more about the place he's from and build on his previous university degrees in history. Jonathan joins me today to talk about what he's learning about Indigenous-Mennonite relations from his historical research of land and water in the West Reserve at the MHA and other archives. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks. Good to be here.
You came across some records about Métis laborers being hired to construct drainage ways. Is there any more you can say about that?
Those are RM records from would have been late 1800s, early 1900s, like 1880s to early 1900s, in the RM of Stanley, so kind of closer towards the Pembina Hills, just in the little snippet of what was the West Reserve at one time. There I was looking for names, really, names that I sort of had known from my research to be Métis names, Métis families who were in the area. And then every now and then I would see one of these names pop up in RM ledgers of, hired labor who had been hired to do either sort of ditching type work or culvert installations. a bit of road work, I think, like road grading and stuff like that.
That makes sense because I came across data that says in 1878 the Métis of Cypress Hills petitioned the government for land west of the Red River, which is close to the edge of the reserve, as you mentioned. Is there anything else we can learn about it?
Yeah, the Métis of Cypress Hills came from sort of all over the plains, and there were extended families of some of these Métis people who lived like in the West Reserve. They had owned land in the West Reserve, just in sort of the foothills of the Pembina Escarpment. So they had familial connections with like St. Joseph, which later became Walhalla, St. Francis Xavier, and some of those folks who lived kind of in the late 1800s, early 1900s, in and around that corner of the West Reserve, had extended family who ended up living in Cypress Hills at the time that this petition would have been sent to the government. So even though the land in that petition that was being asked for as a Métis reserve, even though the sort of West Reserve portion of that that extended, all the way to the Cypress Hills, and then just a little snippet where the Pembina River flows through the West Reserve, the western part of the West Reserve, the petition land included that as well. So even though it was a little snippet, it doesn't seem to me that the Métis people who had signed that petition, it wasn't sort of just an arbitrary area. They would have known it well because they would have had family members, extended family members who had lived right in that area on both sides of the border. When the Manitoba Act was sort of stating that there would be land for Métis and Métis children available, and they published these stipulations of the types of the areas of land that they wanted, one of the groups of Métis who met and published their sort of demands or requests for the land that they would want, one of those large portions of land extended down from like the Headingley area now, and that part of the Assiniboine River, St. Francis Xavier, all the way down into a strip in the West Reserve, kind of the Pembina Hills, just east of the Pembina Hills West Reserve area. And that was pre-Cypress Hills petition. And so that combined with the Cypress Hills petition example that you mentioned, for us as Mennonites, as someone who grew up in the area, that little corner, along the Pembina Hills, I always think of that and maybe as Mennonites who are interested in history, think of that as kind of the fringes, right? For us as Mennonites, that's kind of the fringe area of it would have been much more central to a Métis homeland, even though we think of that part as fringe. So I think those types of petitions, land petitions, speak to the fact that that place is well known to the Métis and well used by the Métis. Even though it was less used by the time Mennonites came, the Métis hadn't disappeared completely from there for sure.
In a talk you gave at the University of Winnipeg, you referenced a story about an Indigenous person teaching a young Mennonite boy how to trap mink near a creek.
That was from Buffalo Creek, a ways southwest of Altona, 1960s. Maybe early 70s. So that story particularly was of, for part of my research I did a lot of archival research, like you said, at the MHA and other places. I also interviewed a few people who had grown up in the region. And so that's where this story came from, one of the interviews. And the story was that someone, thinking back to childhood, had seen out of the farmhouse out into the creek in winter, had seen a couple people working down in the creek bed. And so he went out, got a little lesson, I guess, he talked about how these two Indigenous trappers they were looking for a mink, and they were sort of tracking the den and using kind of smoke into certain holes of this sort of interconnected den throughout the snow, and how they would sort of make that fire at one point with bulrushes or whatnot from the creek and sort of fan smoke and wait at another end for the animal to come out. And so it was, just a little vignette definitely stuck out for this person. And that's not the only story. That one was from Buffalo Creek, and there's other, there's a story from the Murray River near Halbstadt of, I think in that case, trappers or hunters looking for foxes. I think it's important that people remember those stories, say from their childhood, or because they're often not written down in our Mennonite historical sources of the history of that area. They just speak to a kind of a deeper and broader history of the region. Those stories from the creeks just struck me as so interesting and not typical of the types of stories and histories I was kind of used to hearing and knowing about, this sort of agricultural heartland, right? These spoke of something a little bit different, and that just really intrigued me. So that's where that kind of comes from.
You also mentioned to me that some Mennonite farms hosted Métis hunting parties.
Well, those examples, that was from the MHA when I was looking through the Red River Echo files, back issues from the Altona Echo from would have been the mid-40s and early 50s would have been those examples. Actually, and those examples were of First Nations and Anishinaabe people from Rosa River. They stayed at a Mennonite family's farm. It appears that kind of relationship had gone on for a little while because it was mentioned over a period of years. Every now and then you'd see a little mention of like, oh, so-and-so hunters from east of the Red from Rosa River are staying at so-and-so's house near the Pembina Hills or near Winkler.
And those little tidbits of news showed up in what was then known as the social column. Can you tell me about the social columns in the Red River Valley Echo and other newspapers at the time?
Yes, I love the social columns. Most newspapers from an earlier time period had a version of these pages, right? Social pages and that kind of thing. And I guess these types of things were the small town version of that. So, you get everything from, so-and-so visited their parents, in Winkler. They're visiting from BC or something like that, and they stayed the weekend for a week. I was interested for any examples of sort of encounters with Indigenous groups from around the area. So this would be 1900s again, like 1940s, 50s, 60s. There's a decent amount of sort of like notes on kind of like the cycle of seasons, right? Especially when springtime comes and birds start coming back. Some years see talk about, so-and-so catching or hunting so many ducks, somewhere.
Did you get any sense of the kind of hospitality that the Mennonite hosts offered the hunting parties? Did they feed them? Where did they stay? Did they camp on the farm ground or stay in the barn, or how big the parties were, anything like that?
How big the parties were? So I'm just thinking of the examples that from the social columns. I think that was, at least from what was reported in the newspaper, it would have been a group of 4 or 5. I think there was a group of folks from Rosa River that was fairly well known in the area that trapped and hunted for quite a while. But there's sort of oral histories, and some of the people I talked to, they might host someone for night or host someone either or in their barn or in the house, depending. This example I mentioned earlier about the Murray River, Indigenous people trapping on the Murray near Halbstadt. There was one story that someone had mentioned about their family had just had a family wedding like the day before on the yard, and there was a bunch of leftover food. So this guy, as a boy, had remembered his dad saying, like, "Go, there's a bunch of food left. Go offer some to the guys, working on the hunting or trapping on the creek bed there. They're probably hungry." So there's a lot of neat stories like that.
Well, thanks so much for coming in to talk about your findings, Jonathan, and all the best as you proceed with your research.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
The Mennonite Heritage Village Museum has an excellent primer on their website titled Mennonites, Métis, and First Nations People. To see photos related to this episode or to hear it again online, visit mharchives.ca. As always, we're happy to receive your comments and questions about this program via emails to info@mharchives.ca.
Hello, I'm Conrad Stace, the archivist at the Mennonite Heritage Archives. Your donations help preserve and share stories like the one you just heard. To send a gift, visit our website at mharchives.ca and click on Support, or give us a call at 204-560-1998. Thanks also to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, Mennonite Church Canada, and Golden West Radio.
In an upcoming episode, we'll share the story about Maria Craker-Neufeld, who migrated from Imperial Russia to Canada and then to Paraguay. Her collection of letters with her children paint a picture of what it was like to start life over again in the early 1900s. As always, thanks to the Tales team of Conrad Stace, Graham Unruh, and Kaylee Dyck for their work on the program. I'm your host, Dan Dyck. Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives will be back soon with more stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. Thanks for listening.